So hi everyone. I'm going to speak a bit about a project that we affectionately call StewMap. But the title of my presentation is Visualizing Civic Environmental Stewardship for Urban Planning and Development. And as Dana mentioned, I'm with the Northern Research Station based in New York City and work with the New York City field station there. And we work quite closely with land managers, and in many ways, the tool I'm going to share with you was conceived with them in mind. We certainly had a research a study plan and agenda and research questions, but in addition, we really wanted this to be useful to managers that we work with in the Parks Department and other land managers throughout the city each day. Oh, and that's a shot of our field station. Come visit us in New York City, Bayside, Queens, and we have a residential facility as well, which you can learn more about on the website. So we're trying to cultivate a network of folks working, thinking, and learning about all of these things. Now, just to give some framing to where we're coming from, you know, when we conceived of the stewardship mapping and assessment project, we really wanted to understand and highlight the role of people or humans as agents of positive change, you know, and we also, and creators of innovation. We often think of people as, you know, the technologies and machines that we create, but we also create incredible forms of social organizations and institutions and ways of being and ways of working together. And so you'll see in the presentation how StewMap is an attempt to visualize and highlight our role as, you know, creating new forms of governance and stewardship that can benefit the environment and ourselves. So when we talk about stewardship, we study and think about it across a range of site types, what we call, you know, different types of site types, ranging from, you know, upland forests to wetland areas to community gardens on street corners and vacant lots to urban farms to green infrastructure installations like green streets and bioswales. So we're looking across these range of site types and time frames and when these urban designs and ideas emerged in the urban landscape. And across different geographies as well. The project I'll present, the tool I'll present, StewMap, is going to focus on New York City, but it's been adapted in other areas like Chicago and Baltimore and Seattle, Los Angeles, and now in San Juan as well in partnership with Tischa and her colleagues. So, and it's also been applied at the regional level too. So just a little bit more, you know, why we study stewardship groups across these site types. You know, the community gardening movement in this country, and in particular, you know, I draw here upon the one in New York City. You know, really community gardens emerged in the 1970s from the urban fiscal crisis, you know, and so we saw people, you know, growing vegetables and creating these green oases on vacant lots in and around the city. But they were temporary, not permanent places, somewhat ephemeral, if you will. But fast forward 30 years, and there's nearly 1,000 community gardens in the city of New York, managed and stewarded by multiple generations in a complicated and wonderful mix of different governing regimes. And of course, it's become a social movement and a permanent part now of the New York City landscape. So, you know, this is why we give so much value and want to learn more about these emerging site types and these new ways of being in and around the environment. We also look at more formal processes of cultivating stewardship. So we'll look at campaigns, if you will. In New York City, we have something called the Million Trees NYC tree planting campaign. And so we've studied and tried to look at this campaign as a way to recruit new membership and new stewards at the individual level into these initiatives. And I just highlighted here what we found is that for those who engage in first-time tree planting, and we track them over the course of 2 years, that simple act of planting a tree, because it's so accessible, because it's so tangible, because it's so inspiring in many ways, the things you can do with your friends and your family and so forth, you know, it gave people the confidence to engage in other acts civic engagement, and so strengthening our democratic practices, if you will. So it's, it sounds like it's a simple tree planting, but it actually is on a pathway to much more. But I share that all in preface to understanding, why we want to map stewardship, why we want to understand stewardship, in a much grander way. We want to understand it across all these site types, as we've mentioned, across time and space. And in the case of the StewMap project, we cast the net very wide. So if you, in some way, shape, or form, as a group, can serve, manage, monitor, advocate, or educate the public about the local environment, you're qualified to be in the StewMap family. You are part of that group that we want to understand and learn more about. So that's how we define stewardship. And you can think about the StewMap project primarily simply as, we have wonderful maps, certainly much more detail than we could ever have done 10, 15 years ago of green space, urban or otherwise. And you can think of StewMap as a social layer, overlaying the green space that we can understand and visualize in a city or a region. Who's managing? Who's taking care of that space? Now we know when when someone owns the land, government or private sector, we know, okay, those folks, what the responsibility of the parks departments are in various cities. But this civic arena, these groups that emerge every day and sometimes last for decades and decades, we know less about that, but they're performing an important service, important role in managing the landscape in the city. So we think of StewMap as this social layer or social space. And I'll share with you what we did and some of the products. So essentially, StewMap is a census. And in New York City, one of the first formal StewMap census we did, we initially had a sample size of about 5,800 groups. And we took those groups from all the different folks and organizations you see on the cover here of our census. They provided their membership list to us. We sorted through them. We saw the gaps and the overlaps, and then we sent out an online and mail-in survey to these folks. And we wanted to find out just basic organizational characteristics, staffing size, budget, mission statement, areas of interest. But we also wanted to know their stewardship turf, as we call it, or their stewardship footprint. Where exactly do they manage? Remember the definition: advocate for, educate, and so on, in the city. And what's their boundary area? And we also wanted to know who they were connected to, because we assumed in a city the size of New York with 8 million people, it's a complex regime of different connections, and it doesn't really comport to this, hierarchy of, top-down planning and development, but that people are making connections in all different ways. So we wanted to develop a tool that can sort of capture that, and we can learn from it. So in terms of organizational characteristics, just this is the back of the envelope, what we learned. Essentially, New York City has a fair number of small groups, what we call the mom-and-pop groups, small groups that emerge, but could be in service to the city and to the landscape for decades. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have our what we call million-dollar groups, so groups that are really, have all different types of financing and are working at a much greater scale, I guess, and capacity. We have a lot of groups that over the years have become more formalized. So what started as a group of friends, on a block to try and clean up their neighborhood has, in many cases, led to, formal 501c3 status and maybe a staff person or two and so on. They've really formalized their role or professionalized their role as stewards. We've also learned that the number of these type of stewardship organizations have increased from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s until today. And today we see, and I'll show you another slide, see a lot more coalition building, alliances, this kind of things, people working across different sectors together on a particular issue. And in New York, at least at the time of the StewMap survey, which was in 2007, there was really a lot of land-based stewardship groups, folks working on public parks, community gardens, street trees, and now I dare say we're gearing up to do this again, and we might potentially find more water-based groups as other issues come to fore. People are now concerned over the effects of climate change, and of course we had Hurricane Sandy in our region, and we may see that in response to these events and issues that new types of groups are forming. And so we've tried to serve up the data in a number of different ways, and we put most of our data, even before we wrote our first journal article, we put the data up on an open website called Oasis, and so that you could see how the stewardship groups cluster together. This is New York City, from 30,000 feet, so to speak. But that you could also start to drill down and see where the gaps and overlaps are. So this is a particular, insert from an area in Manhattan. And I'm going to click through a few slides. So we query, the stewardship database if someone's interested in, well, I'd like to do some work west side of Central Park in Manhattan. Who else is doing things in common with me? You may not know. In a city this size, we sometimes, whoever's on the next block, sometimes you don't know all your neighbors. So this is just a couple of slides to click through. So these different polygons and colors represent different turfs. Remember, I talked about turfs. So they represent groups and where they are working or where they consider themselves the chief advocate or steward of a particular site. And you can see that there's overlaps. And when we show this to community groups, sometimes they don't even realize that they're all working in the same area. And sometimes that builds new alliances and partnerships, and sometimes it's just good to know. So you can see, again, another version of that. This is kind of a stewardship intensity map of New York City. In the areas in red are where we have the most intense clustering of stewardship groups. And for me, what's most profound, there's many interesting things about this, and we've written about it, but what's most profound is what I learned is that in the places where we have the least green, where there's the least amount of open space, is where we have the highest density of stewardship groups. And that reminds me that in many ways, if you will, nature, it's not so much about the abundance of nature, but it's about how it exists within us. And that even in places that, have been highly developed, industrialized areas, you've got people moving into these communities or have been there maybe all along and really still feel and want and need to have the abundance of nature around them. And we'll fight for that, we'll organize for that, and we'll spend a fair bit of their time contributing to that, to a greater, greener vision. I mentioned before how we saw the growth, of stewardship groups clearly in New York post-1970s, but we've also seen how it's historically been there. So, since the 19th century, there's been civic environmental stewardship groups in New York City, but they've evolved through these different types of social movements and periods of development in the city, but also the country. And here we are today now. I should say, if you see, I should go through the 19th century, the progressive era, the time of the technocrats and the power brokers. We get to the 1950s and 60s, a lot of homeowners associations interested in tree planting. Then in the 60s, anything goes, and we see an emergence of all different types of arts and culture groups interacting with the environment. And then it's us versus them. We see, in the immediate post-1970s period, a lot of contention, a lot of groups formed. Stewardship groups formed in opposition to government and opposition to development. And then we're in this period where I don't think it's all wine and roses, but we see a lot more coalition groups and collaboration happening now. And this is the information we can glean from the SUMAP census. We can also serve up maps like this, and I joke sometimes to my friends in the Forest Service and say, this isn't a map of coyotes or bear. This is actually a map of stewardship groups surrounding a particular urban park. And so the green being the park space and the rings around it, and then you can see those dots tagged to numbers, and those numbers kind of correlate to actual data that will tell you about that organization, about its spatial footprint, about its networks, and about its characteristics. So we try as best we can to visualize this in a number of different ways. And finally, as Tischa was saying, we've done some stewardship network mapping, and we've done it on a scale where this is sort of a useful image, but it's sort of like eye candy, as we say. But it is a group of the stewardship. It is a depiction of the stewardship network in New York City, circa 2007, across business, government, and NGOs, or civic stewardship groups. And you can see in some of these next slides a little bit more clearly once we pick it apart and how it could be useful to people. Look just at the civic groups and how they're connected to each other. We see that there's this inner core, if you will, and even if you see the darker clusters there, those are sort of nodes. But you can see this inner core of groups, and then you can see the isolates around. And these are the groups. We can tag this to particular neighborhoods. So we know particular neighborhoods in New York City that are the least connected. And, by the connection of one or two ties or clicks, they're off the grid. They're not, communicating and sharing information with the whole. So drilling down a little bit further, blowing up this image of the nodes in the network, we can start to identify strategically who are the gatekeepers, if you will. I shouldn't say gatekeepers. Who are the brokers or the bridgers? Actually, not gatekeepers at all. The brokers or the bridgers in this group that are sharing information and materials. Tischa's work is so elegant because she really has a greater understanding in San Juan about the nature of these connections, of what kind of knowledge people and groups are sharing. We in New York City at this scale just know that they're connected, and we know that these are the most connected organizations. And, if anyone was a doubter of this technique, it was me, because I've worked in New York City for 20 years, and I said, well, I could tell you right off the top of my head who these organizations are. And I was wrong. My list didn't comport with this list, and a little bit, but not entirely. And it really was a great exercise for us all. Since that time, we've gone back to those nodes in our stewardship networks, and we've conducted interviews. We've tried to learn a little bit more about what these groups are doing for these other stewardship groups and how they are serving as a broker. And in many ways, they're providing information, sometimes resources and grants, but they're also mediating conflict in communities and responding. I have a colleague, James Connolly, is working on a paper now and looking at how these nodes responded after Hurricane Sandy, because many of did. Many of them provided resources, information, food, and in response to that event. So you can see that understanding the strategic nodes network has a lot of application, not just for environmental stewardship, but for resilience, social resilience. In conclusion, I think stewardship and stewardship mapping has multiple applications. And, in today's, as we mentioned, the rise of land use coalitions and land trusts and alliances, doing a StewMap census to add on to your, green map and planning documents is probably a good idea. Also, in terms of building in participatory design and project development and engaging the civic sector in your project, StewMap is also useful. We're learning more about how, obviously greening, urban greening or otherwise is useful as a recovery mechanism. When people are experiencing a disturbance like something we did with Hurricane Sandy, but of course, any other examples you could, in your own experiences, the simple act of planting a tree helps reknit communities together, and we're seeing that the StewMap networks play a role in that. And lastly, we see that greening is also, in many ways, a mediating mechanism. Those nodes that we talked about, or I talked about in the stewardship network, they are mediating conflict between government and our communities. And sometimes it's about the environment, and sometimes it's about a whole host of other planning issues, and that's okay, and that's actually a good thing, and that helps strengthen social trust and build community. So I want to thank, of course, StewMap, as I said, has been up and running in a number of different cities and places, and these are some of the brave souls that have adopted it and taken it to their communities and have also enriched what we've done in New York, certainly along the way. We continue to learn or as always, are interested in feedback and how this information could be more useful. So thank you.